long before the word Britain held meaning, and long before empires raised flags upon its soil, a cold and ancient land slumbered at the edge of the world. This was not yet an island, but a corridor of earth connecting to what we now call Europe, a bridge where life crept slowly forward beneath vast, ice-laden skies. It was here that the first whispers of humanity echoed, not through cities or battles, but through survival, through firelight, stone, and silence. Nearly 1,000,000 years before modern history began, the Paleolithic period unfolded. Hominids, ancient relatives of humankind, ventured into this forbidding land, crossing from the continental shelf of Europe, unaware they were etching the first chapter of a timeless saga. These early pioneers did not build cities or monuments, but left behind their testament in the form of hand axes buried deep in the earth, and carved flint tools sharpened by instinct and necessity. These tools were crude yet profound. Crafted with care and intuition, they offer modern archaeologists glimpses into the minds of beings who did not speak as we do, but who knew the rhythm of the land intimately. They hunted elk, wild cattle, and boar, stalked by predators now extinct, giant bears, wolves, and saber-tooths, while navigating forests dense with mystery. These early inhabitants were not just surviving. They were adapting with a resilience that would become a hallmark of the British spirit. The land they walked was not the Britain we recognize. Sea levels were vastly different. Much of modern England was connected by tundra to France, the Netherlands, and beyond. This open world allowed for migration and mingling, but also for isolation when the seas rose. Britain, eventually cut off, became a crucible of evolution and ingenuity. What was once a crossroads now became a cauldron where humanity was tested by ice, storm, and solitude. Some of the most stunning discoveries from this time include wooden spears found in the mud of Essex, nearly 500,000 years old, yet remarkably preserved. Their existence reveals not only craftsmanship but planning, memory, and a clear understanding of the hunt. Wood rarely survives the ages, and so when it does, it speaks volumes. These were not mindless wanderers. They were problem solvers, strategists, and survivors in a world without mercy. The people of Paleolithic Britain were few, and their lives harsh. They lived not in kingdoms, but in kinship groups, small bands of families huddled in limestone caves, carving out warmth where they could. Fire was both weapon and sanctuary. Bones charred in fire pits tell us of evenings spent around the glow, roasting meat, whispering primitive tales, warding off the darkness with flame. Yet, for all their struggle, beauty thrived. In tools we see elegance. Flint struck at perfect angles to produce sharp edges. Some of the sites bear hundreds of discarded flakes, hinting at communal workshops where toolmaking was shared knowledge, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. In this, we glimpse the beginnings of education, of culture, of legacy. These tools also tell of change. Earlier hand axes were thick and clumsy. Later ones became sleek, leaf-shaped, aerodynamic. This wasn't accident, it was evolution. Knowledge was accumulating, patterns were forming. Though no written words remain, their lives were chronicled in stone, in muscle memory, and in fire. During the Ice Ages, much of Britain became uninhabitable. Massive glaciers descended, driving the inhabitants southward. Yet as the climate thawed, they returned. Again and again, waves of migration and retreat. But each return brought adaptation. When the cold relented for good, roughly 11,000 years ago, Britain transformed. Forests of birch, hazel, and elm erupted from the earth, and with them came life. Hunter-gatherers became attuned to the rhythms of this reborn world. They tracked reindeer and horse, changed their diets with the seasons, and began to understand the migration patterns of both prey and plant. Archaeological sites from this era show winter camps and summer retreats, signs that mobility was no longer chaos, but strategy. One of the most remarkable aspects of this era was the shift in mindset. Rather than deplete a single area, These early Britons practiced what we might now call environmental balance. They moved between regions, allowing land and wildlife to regenerate. This wasn't just instinct, it was wisdom. Along the coasts, a new relationship began to form with the sea. Shell middens, vast mounds of discarded mollusk shells, suggest an increasing reliance on fish and ocean life. This shift wasn't just culinary. It forced new innovations. Fish hooks, nets, watercraft, evidence of humans not just surviving, but mastering their environment. Around 4100 BC, a quiet revolution began. Agriculture, introduced from the east, took root. The forest was cleared not by fire, but by tools. Flint-tipped axes and sharpened digging sticks turned wilderness into fields. Emmer wheat and barley were planted. The hunt gave way to the harvest, and with it came permanence. Communities began to settle. Houses replaced camps. Long barrows housed the dead in communal tombs, a powerful sign that these people were not just surviving anymore. They were remembering. They were honoring. The first sacred spaces emerged. Not cathedrals, but earthworks, monuments of soil and stone aligned with the stars. Stonehenge was not yet built, but its shadow was forming. These people, long thought primitive, watched the skies. They measured time by the heavens. They organized their lives by the seasons. In doing so, they became something new, not just beings who lived in nature, but those who interpreted it. The Neolithic era of Britain closes the prehistoric chapter of this land with elegance and awe. It marks the first spark of what would become culture, faith, architecture, and identity. And though their names are lost to time, the echoes of these people live on, in the fields they sowed, the tools they shaped, and the earthworks that still stand in silence beneath modern skies. Before there were kings, cathedrals, or crowns, there was this, a land shaped not by conquest, but by curiosity. A people who walked not in armies, but in kin. And a history not written in books, but carved into stone, buried beneath the soil, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The Neolithic era didn't erupt with sudden innovation. It seeped into the soil like a quiet tide, changing the landscape slowly, almost imperceptibly, but forever. As Britain warmed and the forests deepened, humanity shifted from wandering survivors to grounded cultivators. And with this shift came not just new tools but new thought. For thousands of years, hunter-gatherers had followed the rhythm of seasons, tracking prey and harvesting what the land would freely give. But around 4100 BC, a new way of life emerged, likely brought by waves of migrants from continental Europe. These pioneers didn't come with swords or war. They came with seeds, and with them, they planted the roots of permanence. Fields replaced wild plains. Where once herds were chased across valleys, now pigs and cattle were penned near wooden homes. Crops like barley and emmer wheat rose from cleared plots. Humanity, for the first time, began to shape nature not out of fear, but out of purpose. They became not just dwellers of the land, but sculptors of it. The earliest villages were modest, clusters of timber-framed homes with thatched roofs and earthen floors. Yet they were revolutionary. These were not temporary shelters against the cold. They were homes meant to last. With shelter came storage, and with storage came stability. This transformation freed people from the desperation of daily survival and gave birth to something remarkable. Time to think, to plan, to dream. Communities grew around these settlements. People gathered not only to share labor, but to share stories, rituals, and the first glimmers of belief. The dead were no longer left to the forests or caves. They were buried in monumental tombs, long barrows, constructed with earth and stone, often aligned with celestial events. Death had become sacred. Remembrance had begun. But perhaps the most symbolic expression of this new worldview were the henges, circular enclosures built of ditches, earthworks, and eventually megalithic stones. While their precise purpose remains cloaked in mystery, their symbolism is unmistakable. These were not military defenses. They were spiritual centers, calendars of stone, altars of the heavens, places where humanity met the divine. Among the most iconic of these is Stonehenge, begun around 3000 BC. Though centuries would pass before it reached its final form, its earliest design reveals an obsession with celestial cycles. The solstices, summer and winter, were carved into its very alignment. This was not merely a construction, it was a conversation with the cosmos. As belief systems grew more complex, so too did the objects of daily life. Pottery shifted from crude, round-bottomed vessels to beautifully decorated flat-based pots. These ceramics were not just practical, they were expressions of art and identity. Some were etched with patterns, others with fingerprints of their creators. They were used for beer, dairy, and stew, a testament to both tradition and innovation. Flint tools also became more sophisticated. Axe heads were polished smooth, and arrows evolved into various shapes, leaf-bladed, chisel-pointed, transverse, for different kinds of game and combat. The presence of these tools in burial sites suggests they were not just used, they were valued, perhaps even revered. The Neolithic peoples of Britain were not homogeneous. Different groups brought different techniques, beliefs, and social orders. Yet there is evidence of cross-cultural exchange, of ideas shared across valleys and mountains. The circular enclosures called causewayed camps spread across the island, indicating a growing unity in ceremonial practice. These enclosures, some over 10 kilometers in circumference, were feats of engineering. Constructed without metal, using only bone, wood, and stone, they required the labor of hundreds. Their very existence suggests complex leadership, communal effort, and a shared vision that stretched far beyond the needs of any one family or tribe. Social hierarchies began to emerge. Not everyone worked the fields. Some planned, led rituals, crafted tools, or guarded sacred knowledge. This shift hints at the dawn of class, the earliest distinction between laborer and leader. Yet, unlike later feudal systems, Neolithic society likely remained deeply communal. As populations grew, so too did tensions. While evidence of violence is rare, the appearance of defensive earthworks and fortified dwellings suggests that competition for land and resources began to take hold. Conflict was not yet common, but it was no longer unimaginable. Despite these pressures, cooperation remained central. Trade networks spanned hundreds of miles. Obsidian, flint, and even early copper traveled through these channels. People bartered not just goods, but ideas, agricultural techniques, religious concepts, architectural methods. The role of women in Neolithic Britain, though difficult to fully reconstruct, appears far more central than in later patriarchal systems. Figurines and burial practices indicate they may have served as priestesses, midwives, or matriarchal leaders. The fertility of land and womb were both celebrated and feared, a duality reflected in their myths and rites. Spiritual life deepened with the land. Trees, rivers, hills, these were not resources but ancestors. Animism dominated, where everything living and inert possessed a spirit. Rituals involving offerings, feasting, and perhaps even human sacrifice became the seasonal rhythm of life. The seasons themselves were sacred. Solstices and equinoxes marked the turning of the agricultural calendar. Great fires were lit on midsummer nights. Bones were buried at midwinter. These weren't just superstitions, they were how a people remembered time before clocks and explained change before science. Toward the end of the Neolithic period, around 2500 BC, signs of exhaustion appear. The land, heavily farmed, began to show strain. Forests receded. Conflicts may have escalated. And in this period of environmental stress, the seeds of the next revolution were sown, not of earth but of metal. The Bronze Age loomed. Yet the legacy of the Neolithic is undeniable. It gave Britain its first monuments, its first farmers, its first religions. It transformed the island from a patchwork of nomadic trails to a sacred landscape filled with story and stone. These people, who never built cities, wrote laws, or named kings, nonetheless built the foundation upon which all of British history would rise. As the final shadows of the Neolithic age stretched across the land, A new light flickered on the horizon, a fiery glow that would forever reshape the island's destiny. The discovery of metalworking didn't arrive as a sudden revelation, but rather as a sacred knowledge passed westward from the heart of Europe. With it came the Bronze Age, beginning around 2200 BC in Britain, a time when the earth itself yielded treasure, and flame became the key to progress. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, shimmered with an otherworldly luster. Harder and more durable than stone, it brought forth a revolution. Tools that had once fractured after repeated use were now reforged in gleaming strength. Axes, chisels, and sickles no longer merely shaped wood. They shaped societies. But bronze was rare, and those who controlled its trade held the power to build or destroy civilizations. With the mastery of metal came a transformation not just in tools, but in identity. The people who once lived in loosely organized farming communities began to congregate around powerful leaders, men who commanded access to the forges, the mines, and the sacred metals. These figures weren't simply chiefs. They were the first to be seen as kings. Burial customs shifted, reflecting this newfound status. Where Neolithic long barrows once served as communal tombs, now barrow graves housed individual elites. Beaker-style pottery accompanied the dead, filled with fermented drinks and symbolic offerings. Bronze daggers were laid across the chests of fallen warriors, their handles intricately adorned. These were not only weapons, they were status, soul, and story. Trade intensified as Britain became integrated into a growing pan-European network. Tin from Cornwall, a critical ingredient in bronze making, became a prized export. In return came gold, amber, exotic stones, and even ideas. From Ireland to Iberia, from the Alps to the Aegean, a silent conversation carried on via rivers and seas, each exchange enriching both parties. This wealth brought both collaboration and competition. Settlements expanded into enclosed villages, often ringed with timber palisades or ditches. These were not yet cities, but they spoke of growing complexity. Territoriality began to emerge. The land, once sacred and shared, became divided, parceled, and protected. Weapons took on new, dangerous beauty. Daggers grew into rapiers and later into the first bronze swords. Shields were embossed with swirling motifs, their craftsmanship almost ceremonial. But these were not mere symbols, they were instruments of defense and dominance. Battles were now decided not by brute tools but by forged precision. Evidence from excavation sites shows that some weapons were deliberately damaged before burial, a ritual to kill the blade, rendering it unusable by enemies or spirits. This practice hints at a people deeply spiritual, intertwining combat with cosmology. The warrior and the priest may have shared more in common than we might imagine. Communities were increasingly organized by kinship and clan, but ruled by a new elite. These ruling families began to distinguish themselves through material display, jewelry, clothing, burial rites. The beginnings of social inequality were forged in bronze just as surely as the blades were. Power no longer came only from wisdom or strength, but from metallurgy. The economy matured. Craftsmen, once generalists, began to specialize. There were potters, smiths, miners, and traders. Some settlements near copper and tin sources became centers of production. The notion of surplus, of creating not just enough but more than enough, emerged. This surplus allowed for exchange, tribute, and hierarchy. Domestic life also changed. Houses became more refined, often circular in design, with central hearths and storage pits. Families became economic units, contributing to collective wealth. Women played key roles not only in household management, but in textile production, farming, and perhaps even spiritual leadership. Gender roles existed, but they were not rigid. Religion evolved alongside society. The sun, fire, and metal took on sacred connotations. The act of forging, of transforming raw earth into tools, was seen as magical, perhaps even divine. Ritual sites began to incorporate bronze objects. Offerings were cast into rivers and bogs, believed to be gateways between worlds. One of the most enigmatic legacies of this era lies hidden in the wetlands: perfectly preserved wooden trackways, food containers, tools, and even textiles. In the anaerobic mud, time held its breath. These remnants whisper of an age that teetered between advancement and the elements. It is here we glimpse the intimacy of Bronze Age life, its vulnerability, its creativity, and its defiance against the elements. Climate change struck again around 1000 BC. Weather patterns shifted. Rains grew relentless. Fertile land became bog and marsh. Some regions were abandoned. Others innovated. Raised walkways were built over wetlands. Houses lifted on stilts. Even in adversity, invention persisted. Still, these environmental pressures bred conflict. Competition for arable land intensified. Raids became more frequent. Boundaries once informal hardened into tribal domains. The era that had begun in cooperative marvel now simmered with guarded suspicion. Fences replaced open meadows. Forts replaced fields. Yet amid the challenges, the Bronze Age never stopped dreaming. Decorative arts flourished: golden torques, sun discs, and crescent-shaped ceremonial blades unearthed from sacred sites continue to dazzle modern eyes. They were not only art, they were metaphors tying earth and sky, death and birth, man and myth. Toward the close of this era, bronze itself began to lose its power. Iron, cheaper and stronger, quietly entered the forges. It did not gleam like bronze, but it endured. And slowly, silently, the world turned again. The Bronze Age had forged more than tools. It had forged tribes, kingdoms, rituals, and myths. It gave Britain its first real glimpse of what it meant to organize, to rule, to worship, and to fight. In its molten core was the beginning of society as we understand it today. The metal may tarnish, but the fire it sparked still burns beneath the surface of every British stone. As bronze dimmed and the last of its luster faded beneath the changing sky, a new material emerged from the earth: iron. Unlike bronze, it wasn't rare or regal. It didn't shine gold under the sun. But it was stronger, harder, and more democratic. The Iron Age had arrived, and with it, a world reborn in steel. Around 800 BC, the forge changed everything. Iron didn't require distant trade networks to access exotic metals. It lay beneath British soil, waiting to be pulled from its resting place and transformed in the fire. Tools improved dramatically. Plows cut deeper, axes cleaved cleaner, and weapons struck harder. Entire settlements now revolved around blacksmiths and their embers. Communities became more independent. No longer bound by the wealth of tin or copper, even small tribes could arm themselves. But it was not just tools that changed, so too did society. Hierarchies flattened slightly. Power shifted from elite bronze traders to warrior chieftains who could control iron and command loyalty. This new world gave rise to the Celts, though they would never have called themselves that. The term Celt comes from the Greeks, who referred to these diverse tribes with a single label, Keltoi, or barbarians. But to the people of Iron Age Britain, identity was far more localized, defined by clan, by region, and by ancestry. The Celts were not one people but many. Tribes such as the Iceni, Brigantes, and Trinovants carved their domains across Britain and Ireland. Despite linguistic and cultural similarities, they often fought as much with each other as they did with outsiders. Yet what bound them together was a shared aesthetic, a love for the swirling, interwoven patterns we still associate with Celtic art today. Life in Iron Age Britain was rich, rhythmic, and deeply connected to the land. Roundhouses dotted hilltops and valleys, their thatched roofs rising like domes from the earth. Inside, families gathered around central hearths. The air smelled of peat smoke, roasted grain, and iron. Livestock roamed freely in pens outside, guarded not by walls, but by memory and tradition. Hill forts became the defining architectural symbol of the time. Not necessarily built for war, many served as economic and spiritual centers. with walls of timber and stone, and gates adorned with carved posts. These forts were both sanctuary and symbol, places where chieftains held court, where festivals echoed with music, and where warriors trained for the uncertain future. Religion in this age was elemental. The Celts saw divinity in rivers, in trees, in stones and sky. Sacred groves replaced temples. The oak was especially revered, a bridge between worlds. Druids, the priestly class, acted as spiritual leaders, judges, healers, and keepers of memory. They spoke not with ink, but with voice, passing knowledge through story and song. The Druids' wisdom gave the Celts unity across distance. Though scattered, their beliefs held them together. Mistletoe, harvested with golden sickles under the moonlight, was considered a gift of the gods. Rituals often involved offerings, sometimes of valuables, sometimes of life. Bodies found in bogs with signs of sacrifice hint at ceremonies meant to appease the unseen. Art flourished even in warfare. Shields were embossed with intricate spirals. Swords bore patterns of twisted iron. Jewelry, such as torques and armlets, glinted with beauty and menace. These objects were not only adornments, they were declarations of identity, proof of rank, and talismans of divine protection. Women in Celtic society held considerable power. Unlike in many later cultures, Celtic women could own land, inherit titles, and even lead armies. Queens like Boudica would later rise from this tradition, fierce embodiments of matrilineal respect and tribal resilience. Trade remained crucial, but it was now directed by land and war. Roads, forged through forests and river valleys, connected hill forts and outposts. Salt, livestock, grain, and iron goods were exchanged at seasonal gatherings. Coins began to appear, stamped with horses, spirals, and suns. Early whispers of economy and statehood. Yet not all was harmonious. As tribes grew in power, so did their ambition. Raids were common. Conflicts broke out over grazing land, sacred sites, and trade routes. The spear became as central to Celtic life as the plow. Alliances shifted with seasons, and peace was as fleeting as the harvest wind. Despite their tribal divisions, the Celts of Britain shared a cultural confidence. They believed themselves descended from gods, forged from the earth, and protected by ancestors. Their stories, tales of warrior kings, magical beasts, and shape-shifting druids, formed an oral mythology as vivid as any written epic. But they had no sense of the storm gathering beyond the seas. Far to the southeast, a new power was rising, a civilization obsessed with order, roads, and conquest. Rome had begun to turn its gaze northward, toward the misty lands they still called Albion. To the Romans, the Celts were unruly, undisciplined, ripe for domination. In truth, the Celts were anything but primitive. They possessed laws, art, medicine, and philosophy. Their societies were adaptable and decentralized, a strength in peace, but a weakness in facing empire. Where the Romans moved like a sword, the Celts flowed like water, hard to pin down but easy to divide. And so, as iron continued to pour from forges and war horns echoed across the hills, the fate of Britain hung in the balance. The tribes were proud. The land was sacred, but the legions were coming. The Iron Age had given the British Isles strength, style, and story, but it had also left them unprepared for the disciplined machinery of empire. In the shadow of the rising sun, a new chapter waited, one written not in tribal chant, but in Latin. To the mighty Roman Empire, Britain was a rumor whispered across the waves, a place cloaked in mist, filled with painted warriors, and ruled by spirits of the forest. The Greeks had called it Albion, a land of white cliffs and wild tribes. To Rome, it was both mystery and opportunity. And then, in 55 BC, one man's ambition dared to make the myth real: Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar's first expedition to Britain was not about conquest, but prestige. Locked in rivalry with political enemies in Rome, He sought to outshine them through audacity. Crossing the channel with 2 legions, he landed on the southeastern shores and met fierce resistance. The Celts fought like lightning, swift, unpredictable, vanishing into forests after each strike. Caesar won no cities, claimed no land, but he returned to Rome a hero, a man who had touched the edge of the known world. He returned the following year in 54 BC, with 5 legions and more resolve. This time he fought deeper inland, met tribal kings, and even received hostages. But despite battlefield success, the unpredictable tides and stubborn resistance forced him to withdraw again. Britain, it seemed, was not ready to be ruled, and Rome, for a time, turned its attention elsewhere. Decades passed. While the Roman Empire devoured Gaul, Hispania, and the Mediterranean, the tribes of Britain continued their lives, now aware of the force that lay beyond the sea. Some Celtic leaders formed alliances with Rome, others readied for the next invasion. And in 43 AD, under the cautious but determined Emperor Claudius, Rome returned, not with raiders, but with empire. Claudius dispatched 4 legions and auxiliary forces under the command of Aulus Plautius. They landed at Richborough in Kent and began a systematic campaign. Unlike Caesar's probing missions, this was full-scale war. The legions moved with terrifying efficiency, carving roads through forests, erecting forts overnight, and offering one choice to the tribes: submit or burn. The resistance was fierce. In the Midlands, the legendary warrior Caratacus of the Cativalani tribe led a defiant campaign, waging guerrilla warfare for nearly a decade. He rallied scattered tribes, ambushed supply lines, and became a symbol of unyielding freedom. But in the end, he was captured, paraded through Rome in chains. Before the emperor, he stood unbowed. His bravery won admiration and a pardon. But the land he fought for was now changing forever. The Romans began building their version of civilization, stone by stone. Londinium was established on the banks of the Thames, a trading hub and administrative capital. Roads radiated outward, connecting garrisons, ports, and markets. Amphitheaters rose beside Celtic roundhouses. Bathhouses shimmered with heated water. Latin mingled with Brythonic tongues. Rome had not just arrived, it was embedding itself into the soil. But the island would not yield quietly. In 60 AD, an act of arrogance ignited a fire that nearly drove the Romans back into the sea. Persutigus, king of the Iceni tribe, had died, leaving half his kingdom to Rome and the other half to his wife, Boudica. The Romans wanted it all. They flogged the queen, assaulted her daughters, and seized their lands. The response was swift and savage. Boudica, tall, red-haired, and wrathful, became a flame of vengeance. She united the tribes of eastern Britain and led an army that razed Roman towns. Londinium was burned to ash. Over 70,000 Romans and allies were slaughtered. Rome, for the first time, trembled. It took Governor Suetonius Paulinus and a disciplined counterattack to crush the rebellion. Boudica, rather than be captured, took her own life. Her spirit, though, became eternal. After Boudica, Rome reinforced its grip. Fortresses were expanded. Taxes imposed. Roman law overlaid native custom. Trade flourished. So did slavery. Many Britons adopted Roman fashion, customs, and gods. But in the highlands of the north, resistance still lingered, feral, proud, and fierce. To contain them, the Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall, an immense frontier of stone and watchtowers that cut the island in half. Hadrian's wall was not merely a defensive line, it was a statement, a message to the tribes beyond. This is Rome and you are not. Garrisoned by legions from across the empire, Gauls, Syrians, Spaniards, it became a melting pot of cultures, a frontier where empire and wilderness collided daily. Over time, Rome divided the island into Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior, making administration more manageable. Cities like York, Eboracum, and Chester, Deva, blossomed. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, quietly entered the island through Roman soldiers and merchants. By the 3rd century, bishops met in councils, and the cross began to rival the eagle. Still, the pressure never ceased. Ireland's raiders, Scottish tribes, then known as Picts, and Saxon pirates harassed the coasts. Roman forces, stretched thin across a sprawling empire, began to wane. Rebellions flared. Governors declared themselves emperors. And in 410 AD, Rome, under siege from Germanic tribes, abandoned Britain entirely, recalling its legions to defend the Eternal City. They left behind paved roads, ruined temples, villas, and aqueducts. But more than that, they left an idea of order, hierarchy, and civilization rooted in conquest. The tribes of Britain, once again on their own, inherited both the architecture and the ghosts of empire. The Roman occupation had lasted nearly 4 centuries. Long enough for a child born in a roundhouse to die in a villa. Long enough to change names, customs, faiths, and yet not long enough to extinguish the soul of the land. In the ruins of amphitheaters, druids would whisper again. In abandoned forts, new kings would rise. Rome was gone, but its shadow lingered, etched into stone, sewn into language, and burned into memory. Britain had met the legions, and it had been transformed. When the legions withdrew from Britain around 410 AD, they left behind more than abandoned forts and fading mosaics. They left a vacuum. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had imposed order, law, and infrastructure. Now, with the eagle gone, that order crumbled. Roads decayed, cities emptied, trade collapsed, and the British Isles slipped into a shadowed era. One of warlords, wandering kings, and whispered myths. The native Britons, heirs to a fusion of Celtic tradition and Roman civility, were left exposed. They tried to govern themselves, calling on petty chieftains and Romanized elites to fill the void. But external pressures quickly overwhelmed them. Across the North Sea, the Germanic tribes stirred. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, seafaring people with axes, ambition, and no reverence for Rome. According to tradition, the Britons first invited some of these tribes as mercenaries to defend against Pictish raids from the north. But as the Vortigern legend tells, these allies soon became invaders. The Saxons and their kin saw a land weakened by political chaos and ripe for conquest. They poured in, not all at once, but wave after wave, decade after decade. What followed was not a single war, but generations of migration, invasion, and assimilation. Native British kingdoms like Dumnonia and Powys resisted, but one by one, they were pushed westward. Roman towns were looted or repurposed. Temples became fortresses. Roads became pathways for conquest, not commerce. The old world was dying, and a new one rising from its ashes. The Anglo-Saxons didn't build empires overnight. They established scattered settlements, timber longhouses surrounded by farms and palisades. Their society was tribal, organized around kin and loyalty, not centralized statehood. But what they lacked in bureaucracy, they made up for in endurance. Slowly, their grip deepened. They brought with them a new language, Old English, a tongue that would eventually absorb Celtic, Latin, Norse, and French, becoming the linguistic foundation of modern English. With every village they founded, every boundary they claimed, the shape of Britain's identity shifted. The native Britons who were not slain or enslaved fled west, retreating into the highlands of Wales, Cornwall, and northern Scotland. There, their languages, Welsh, Cornish, and Cumbric, survived. So too did their legends. Tales of Arthur, the once and future king, emerged from this cultural collision, perhaps a memory of a war leader who briefly stemmed the Saxon tide. The Saxons worshipped gods older than Christ, Woden, Thunor, Frigg, deities of war, sky, and fate. Sacred groves replaced basilicas. Animal sacrifice replaced Eucharist. Christianity, once the soul of Roman Britain, flickered only in remote monasteries and among the Brittonic survivors in the West. Yet by the late 6th century, the winds of faith began to turn. In 597 AD, Pope Gregory the Great dispatched a monk named Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons. He landed in Kent and was welcomed by King Ethelbert, whose Frankish queen was already Christian. Within decades, Christianity spread again, this time from Rome's spiritual authority, not its legions. Monasteries became centers of learning and culture. Scribes illuminated texts. Priests preserved oral histories. The memory of Rome flickered back to life, not as empire, but as church. It was through Christianity that Britain began to unify, not politically but spiritually. Meanwhile, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms matured. 7 major ones emerged: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, later known as the Heptarchy. They warred, traded, intermarried, and occasionally aligned. Some kings rose as Bretwaldas, overlords wielding temporary supremacy. Yet no single kingdom reigned unchallenged. Beneath the political intrigue was a flowering of culture. Northumbria in particular became a beacon of learning. The Venerable Bede, writing in the 8th century, chronicled the early history of England in Latin, preserving the lineages and miracles that define the age. His ecclesiastical history of the English people remains one of the era's greatest achievements. Art thrived in metal and stone. Anglo-Saxon craftsmen etched delicate designs into brooches, swords, and reliquaries. Their illuminated manuscripts, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, blended Roman influence with local flair, testaments to a culture reinventing beauty amid brutality. But power remained fragile. With no central authority, alliances could shift with a death, and borders with a single raid. Kings ruled by charisma, might, and loyalty. A weak ruler could lose a kingdom in a season. A strong one might forge a legacy, but never a lasting peace. Warfare was constant. Battles were fought in forests, moors, and river crossings. Shields locked, spears thrust, swords hacked. Victory was not always to the strong, but often to the cunning. Yet war also created heroes, legends, and lineages that would echo for centuries. While the Anglo-Saxons shaped the lowlands and heartlands, the native Britons never truly vanished. In Wales, defiant leaders like Cadwallon and Rhodri Mar waged campaigns of resistance. In Cornwall and Cumbria, old tongues and traditions lingered like embers beneath the surface. By the 9th century, the Anglo-Saxon world stood relatively stable, but a new storm was gathering beyond the North Sea. Fierce seafarers, Vikings, had begun to raid the coasts of Europe. Soon, their longships would find British shores, and the fragile kingdoms of the Heptarchy would tremble beneath the dragon-headed prows. The age of Anglo-Saxon supremacy was brilliant, brutal, and formative. It birthed the language, customs, and structures that would become English. But it was also transitional, a bridge between Rome's ruins and the storms of Norse fury. A time when Britain redefined itself, not by what it had been, but by what it dared to become. It began with sails on the horizon, silent at first, then swift as a scream. Longships, carved like dragons and stitched with blood-red sails, sliced through the gray waters of the North Sea. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia came men who worshipped gods of thunder and mischief, who sang of Valhalla and laughed in the face of death. The Vikings had arrived, and England would never be the same again. The first recorded raid struck Lindisfarne in 793 AD. A peaceful monastery perched on a tidal island. Its monks lived in prayer and isolation. But that morning, death came wrapped in fire and iron. The invaders showed no mercy. Holy relics were stolen. Sacred texts were burned. Priests were butchered at the altar. The age of faith had collided with the age of fury. The news spread like wildfire. A Christian world already reeling from political instability now faced a threat it could neither understand nor contain. These weren't just pirates. They were warriors, explorers, and settlers with no respect for church, king, or coin. Their motives were simple: plunder, land, glory, and a path to paradise earned through valor. Over the next decades, Viking raids turned into invasions. The longships returned year after year, striking coastal settlements, river towns, and trade routes. No place was safe. From Northumbria to Kent, churches were pillaged, nobles were ransomed, and entire villages were left in smoking ruin. But the Vikings were more than destroyers. They were also traders, craftsmen, and colonizers. By the mid-9th century, they began to settle. The Great Heathen Army, a massive force of Danish warriors, landed in 865 AD under leaders like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. This was not a raid, it was an occupation. The army swept through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with terrifying speed. Northumbria fell. East Anglia was crushed. Mercia fractured. Only one kingdom held firm, Wessex, under the command of a resilient and brilliant leader, Alfred. King Alfred of Wessex became the last hope of Anglo-Saxon England. Driven from his kingdom by Viking assaults, he hid in the marshes of Athelney, gathering strength, allies, and faith. In 878 AD, he struck back at the Battle of Edington, defeating the Danes and forcing their leader, Guthrum, to convert to Christianity. That victory bought peace but not unity. Alfred negotiated the Danelaw, a vast swath of eastern and northern England where Danish laws and customs would prevail. England was now a divided land, half Saxon, half Norse, stitched together by fragile treaties and bristling swords. Despite the division, Alfred saw beyond survival. He reorganized the military, built a navy, and fortified towns known as Buzz. He championed education, translating Latin texts into Old English, and reformed legal codes. Under his vision, England began to look less like a collection of tribes, and more like a nation. Meanwhile, Viking settlers dug deep roots. Towns like York, once Eoforwic, became Norse strongholds, blending Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian cultures. Paganism faded slowly, replaced by Christianity, yet Norse language, place names, and customs endured. The two worlds didn't merely clash, they intertwined. The Vikings brought not just destruction but innovation. Their shipbuilding skills revolutionized naval warfare. Their trade networks connected Britain to Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the frozen corners of the Baltic. Their presence forced the Saxons to evolve or perish. After Alfred's death, his successors carried on his dream. Edward the Elder and Athelstan pushed the Danes back, eventually capturing York. In 927 AD, Athelstan declared himself king of all Britain, a bold proclamation and the first real glimpse of a united England. But unity was a candle flickering in the wind. New waves of Norsemen arrived, not from Denmark, but from Norway and later from Normandy. The most feared of these was King Knut the Great, who led another conquest and, in 1016, became king of a North Sea empire, ruling over England, Denmark, and Norway. Knut's reign brought an odd peace. Though a Viking by blood, he ruled as a Christian monarch, balancing Danes and Saxons, honoring saints and laws alike. Under him, England thrived, but his empire would not last beyond his sons. The threads of conquest unraveled once more. By the mid-11th century, the line of Wessex had returned with Edward the Confessor, a pious king whose rule was marked more by prayer than power. Upon his death in 1066, a succession crisis ignited one final invasion. A storm from across the Channel, bearing not dragon sails, but banners of Normandy. The Viking Age had transformed England, from its blood to its language, from its gods to its rulers. It had forged resilience through fire and memory. Though the raiders would eventually settle, and their lineages become English, their impact would never be undone. From the ashes of monasteries and the cries of kings, a new England emerged, scarred, hardened, yet undeniably richer in its diversity. It was no longer a land of one people. It was a tapestry woven from conquest and compromise. The Norse did not merely leave, they became part of the story. And in the echoes of Old Norse words, the place names that dot the hills, and the warrior pride that still lingers, the Viking spirit endures. 1066, the year etched in every English chronicle, carved into every schoolbook, and whispered in every tale of kings. It was not just a date, it was a turning point. The moment when the fate of England pivoted beneath the weight of ambition, blood, and betrayal. And at its center stood three men who would gamble kingdoms for a crown. With the death of Edward the Confessor, England faced a succession crisis. Edward, saintly and childless, had left no heir. Three powerful men stepped forward. Harold Godwin's son, England's most powerful earl and chosen successor. Harald Hardrada, the formidable king of Norway, claiming Viking blood right, and William, Duke of Normandy, who insisted Edward had promised him the throne years earlier. First came Hardrada. With his ally, Tostig, Harold's estranged brother. He landed in the north, bringing a fleet of Norse warriors in one final bid to reclaim Viking glory. They burned through Yorkshire, sacked villages, and demanded submission. But Harold Godwin's son moved with astonishing speed, marching his army north and crushing Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The Viking Age ended with a sword in the heart and the ashes of a longship funeral. But Harold had no time to savor victory. Even as Norse blood still stained his blades, news arrived. William had landed in the south. With papal blessing and a host of Norman knights, he crossed the Channel, seeking not just conquest but divine right. The two armies met at Hastings on October 14, 1066. The English formed a shield wall on Senlac Hill, unyielding, disciplined, unbroken. The Normans, skilled in cavalry and archery, struck with precision. Again and again they charged and were repelled. Only when the English ranks broke formation, chasing a feigned retreat, did the Normans penetrate their defense. Harold fell, some say with an arrow through the eye, others beneath the sword. Whatever the truth, with his death ended Anglo-Saxon rule. William, now the conqueror, marched to London and was crowned on Christmas Day. A new dynasty had begun, not just of kings but of language, law, and architecture. The Normans didn't simply rule, they remade the realm. They tore down wooden halls and razed stone castles. Towering fortresses like the White Tower of London were not just defenses. They were symbols of dominance, etched into the skyline. The land was parceled out to Norman lords, the old Anglo-Saxon elite pushed aside or extinguished. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, became the ultimate symbol of Norman control. A detailed survey of every village, field, plough, and pig. It revealed the extent of England's wealth and its submission. It was not just a census. It was a reckoning. Language transformed as well. Old English collided with Norman French, birthing Middle English. The court spoke French. The law was recorded in Latin. Peasants clung to their Saxon tongues. But over centuries, the languages blended, forming the backbone of the English we know today. Feudalism entrenched itself. Every man owed loyalty upward, to lord, to king, to God. The countryside was dotted with manors, where villains worked the land in exchange for protection. Life became stratified, ordered, and bound by duty. The church, already powerful, now became an arm of both heaven and crown. Norman bishops replaced native clergy. Cathedrals soared in Romanesque grandeur, Ely, Durham, and Canterbury, all testaments to divine authority and Norman taste. Yet even under conquest, resistance flickered. Rebellions erupted in the north, in the fens, and among dispossessed nobles. William's response was brutal. The harrying of the north left entire regions scorched and starved. Crops were burned, villages razed, people slain. It was genocide by fire and famine. Despite this, the Normans brought stability. Trade revived. Coinage was standardized. Roads improved. England was no longer an isolated kingdom. It was now part of a continental network, its monarch entangled in French politics and papal diplomacy. William ruled with iron discipline, but his legacy was not unchallenged. After his death in 1087, his sons squabbled over his dominions. England became a prize passed between siblings, Robert of Normandy, William Rufus, and Henry I, all wielding the sword and the church to legitimize their claims. Henry I strengthened royal authority, married a Scottish princess to bridge cultures, and established the Exchequer, the foundation of English financial bureaucracy. Yet even his reign ended in uncertainty. His only legitimate male heir drowned in the White Ship, sparking a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. During that chaos, nobles fortified private armies. Castles multiplied. Law dissolved into local tyranny. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn between Stephen and Matilda, nephew and daughter, each laying claim to the throne. Peace returned only with the ascension of Matilda's son, Henry II, who would go on to forge the Plantagenet dynasty. But all of that, anarchy, Plantagenets, Becket, and beyond, began with Hastings, with the fall of an Anglo-Saxon king and the rise of a Norman duke who reshaped the nation's bones. The Norman conquest was not merely a transfer of power. It was a rupture, a redefinition of what it meant to be English. In its wake, identity itself was reforged. Warrior kings and cathedral builders, poets and peasants, conquerors and conquered, all blended in the crucible of change. What emerged was not Saxon, not Viking, not French, but something entirely new. The beginning of England as a kingdom with one foot in Europe and the other in its own ancient soil. As the fires of the anarchy flickered into embers, a new dawn broke across the English throne, one blood-soaked and brilliant, ruthless and reforming. In 1154, a young monarch ascended who would forge a dynasty of legends. Henry II, the first of the Plantagenets. His family would reign for over 300 years, casting shadows that stretched across battlefields, courts, and cathedrals. Henry wasn't just King of England. He was also Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and through his fiery wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, Lord of half of modern France. This vast collection of lands, called the Angevin Empire, made Henry one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, but also the most embattled. His reign began with restoration. The chaos of civil war had shattered royal authority. Barons had built unlicensed castles, minted their own coins, and governed like kings in their fiefs. Henry dismantled hundreds of these fortresses, reimposed royal law, and restructured justice. His legal reforms, circuit judges, jury trials, standardized writs, laid the foundation for the English common law system. But no reform would haunt him like his feud with the church. His childhood friend, Thomas Becket, was made Archbishop of Canterbury, expected to be a loyal servant. Instead, Becket resisted Henry's attempts to curb clerical power. Their friendship withered into rivalry. In 1170, Henry's frustrated words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" were taken as a command. For knights rode to Canterbury and butchered Becket before the altar. The shock reverberated across Christendom. Becket became a martyr. Henry, publicly whipped at Becket's shrine, wept before the world. It was the first time a king had bowed not to a rival, but to the weight of moral outrage. The Plantagenets had discovered that thrones could tremble under prayers as much as swords. Even within his own family, Henry found little peace. Eleanor, once his queen, became his prisoner after supporting their son's rebellion. His children, Richard the Lionheart, John, and others, quarreled constantly, hungry for power. It was a family of titans, each with ambition enough to tear an empire apart. When Henry died in 1189, his son Richard I took the throne. A warrior to his core, Richard spent little time in England. He set off on the Third Crusade, earning fame in the Holy Land for his duels with Saladin. Brave, charismatic, and almost mythical in stature, Richard was also reckless, leaving the kingdom bankrupt and barely governed during his absence. He died childless, and the crown passed to his brother John, a ruler of cunning mind but weak character. John's reign, from 1199 to 1216, became synonymous with failure. He lost most of England's French territories, clashed with the nobility, and taxed ruthlessly. He quarreled with the Pope and was excommunicated. And finally, in 1215, he was forced by rebel barons to sign a document that would echo through the ages: the Magna Carta. This great charter didn't birth democracy, but it planted its seeds. It limited royal power, asserted that the king was not above the law, and protected the rights of free men. Though John tried to nullify it and died soon after, its reissuance under his young son Henry III kept the flame alive. Henry III ruled for over 50 years, an age of building and faith. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey in Gothic grandeur, promoted the cult of Edward the Confessor, and envisioned England as a sacred kingdom. But his mismanagement and favoritism toward foreign advisors led to baronial unrest, culminating in the Second Barons' War, led by Simon de Montfort, a noble who summoned what many consider the first true English Parliament in 1265. Though Montfort was slain in battle, the idea he sparked lived on. The notion that the king could not rule alone, that consultation was required, began to crystallize. The Plantagenets were learning that power, to endure, must share its light. Henry III's son, Edward I, was a different breed, pragmatic, ruthless, and determined. Known as the Hammer of the Scots, Edward expanded English control through brutal military campaigns. He conquered Wales, built towering stone castles to enforce his rule, and subdued its native princes. His Statute of Rhuddlan annexed Wales to the English crown, forever binding its fate. But Scotland resisted. When Edward tried to impose his will, war erupted. The Scottish Wars of Independence birthed heroes like William Wallace, immortalized for his defiance, and later Robert the Bruce, who would lead Scotland to triumph. Edward died on campaign, and his legacy passed to his less capable son. Edward II lacked his father's strength and decisiveness. His reign was marred by scandal, favoritism, and humiliation. The barons rebelled, the Scots crushed the English at Bannockburn, and eventually even his wife, Isabella of France, turned against him. In a chilling reversal of royal dominance, Edward was deposed and, allegedly, murdered in captivity. From that chaos rose Edward III, who restored royal dignity and launched England into a century-defining conflict, the 100 Years' War. But before that tempest, the Plantagenets had already reshaped the soul of England. They had made it legal, political, architectural, and martial. They had brought it parliaments, charters, and crusades. They had brought it both Becket and Bannockburn. Their blood had soaked battlefields and cathedral stones alike. Their legacy was complex, glorious and grotesque, visionary and violent. But they had forged a new kind of monarchy, one that could no longer reign alone, yet still commanded loyalty from an island dreaming of unity. As storms brewed in France and plague loomed on the horizon, England stood at the height of its medieval might, scarred, sacred, and poised for a reckoning that would redefine crowns for centuries to come. The 14th century began with banners unfurled and the thunder of hooves echoing across the fields of France. England, under Edward III, had transformed from a fractured kingdom into a bold empire of ambition. And now the king set his gaze upon the French crown, claiming it as his rightful inheritance. Thus began the 100 Years' War, a conflict not of a single lifetime but of generations. Edward III's claim to the French throne was through his mother, Isabella, a French princess. The French nobility rejected it, naming Philip VI king instead. But Edward would not be denied. In 1337, war erupted, part dynastic struggle, part national awakening. Over time, it became more than a war between kings. It became a crucible for English identity. The early campaigns stunned Europe. In 1346, Edward's army triumphed at Crécy, thanks to a weapon that would change the rules of war forever: the English longbow. Cheap, deadly, and wielded by common men, it turned the tide against heavily armored knights. The flower of French chivalry was cut down by arrows loosed from the hands of peasants. Then came Calais, seized after a brutal siege. It would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, a defiant outpost on French soil. England's prestige soared. But behind the triumphs loomed a silent enemy, more ruthless than any army. In 1348, the Black Death reached England. It arrived on merchant ships, nestled in the fleas of rats. Within months, entire villages were silenced. Bodies were stacked in mass graves. Priests refused to give last rites. Crops rotted in fields. Over 1/3 of England's population perished. An apocalypse wrapped in fever and stench. The plague shattered the old order. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Survivors demanded higher wages, better conditions. The feudal system, already strained, began to unravel. The rigid bonds of lord and serf loosened. A new social awareness stirred, one where labor had value and power could shift. In this climate of change, Edward's heir, the Black Prince, led England to its most dazzling victory at Poitiers in 1356. There, King John II of France was captured and brought to London in chains. The triumph was glorious but costly. The Black Prince would die before becoming king, leaving a void that would drag England toward ruin. The crown passed to his son, Richard II, a boy crowned king in a kingdom fraying at the edges. In 1381, the peasants' revolt erupted. Led by Wat Tyler, thousands of laborers marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, poll taxes, and injustice. For a brief, electrifying moment, the king met them face to face. Promises were made. Then Tyler was murdered and the uprising crushed. But the message lingered: the people could rise. Richard's rule grew increasingly autocratic. Nobles, fearing tyranny, rose against him. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile, seized the throne, and imprisoned Richard. The usurpation marked a turning point. No longer was kingship divinely untouchable. Could be contested, even stolen. Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV, inaugurating the Lancastrian dynasty. His reign was turbulent, plagued by rebellions, illness, and paranoia. But his son, Henry V, would become the warrior king of legend. Crowned in 1413, Henry V reignited the 100 Years' War with devastating precision. In 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt, his outnumbered army of tired, sick soldiers obliterated a vastly superior French force. Mud, longbows, and discipline turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse. French nobility was decimated. Henry stood triumphant. 2 years later, he married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, and secured the Treaty of Troyes, which made him heir to both thrones. For a fleeting moment, it seemed England and France would be united under a single crown. But history would not allow it. In 1422, Henry V died suddenly at the height of his power. His infant son, Henry VI, became king of both England and France, but was too young, too gentle, and too fragile for the world he inherited. The tide turned. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl with divine visions, rallied French morale. Her leadership ignited a reversal. English strongholds fell. Paris remained out of reach. Slowly, inexorably, the dream of a dual kingdom unraveled. Back in England, Henry VI's reign collapsed into inertia. He was a pious scholar, ill-suited for war or politics. Factionalism devoured the court. Nobles vied for influence. The kingdom drifted directionless, rudderless, toward civil war. The 100 Years' War ended in 1453. England had lost nearly all its continental possessions, retaining only Calais. What had begun as a claim to kingship ended in humiliation. Yet from the fires of war came transformation. England had forged a language, a military tradition, a parliament hardened by taxation and resistance, and a populace increasingly aware of its power. But peace would not last. With Henry VI's weakness, two royal houses, Lancaster and York, would soon ignite another conflict, this time not across the Channel, but on English soil. The 100 Years' War had not just reshaped borders. It had shaken the foundations of kingship, class, and identity. England had become a nation of archers and poets, of rebels and saints. It had survived plague and conquest, but ahead lay something more personal, a war of brothers. England stood breathless in the aftermath of the 100 Years' War, exhausted by foreign conflict, but unaware that a far more intimate storm loomed ahead. What had begun as disputes between barons over influence at court would spiral into 3 decades of fratricidal conflict. This was no foreign war. This was Englishman against Englishman, cousin against cousin. The bloodbath that followed would be known as the Wars of the Roses. The seeds of war were sown in the fragile reign of Henry VI. Pious, soft-spoken, and prone to bouts of mental collapse, he lacked the steel to rule. Under his watch, England lost its holdings in France and its nobility fractured into competing factions. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was fiercely protective of their son, while his cousin, Richard, Duke of York, believed he had a stronger claim to the throne. In 1455, at the First Battle of St. Albans, swords clashed and Yorkist banners rose. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York became emblems of a nation at war with itself. These were not wars fought solely on distant fields. They engulfed cities, villages, even churches. The very soul of England was pulled into the fray. Richard of York died in battle, but his cause did not. His son, Edward IV, emerged a charismatic and capable leader. In 1461, after the brutal Battle of Towton, the bloodiest ever fought on English soil, Edward seized the throne. Snow fell red that day. Over 20,000 men died in one battle. The scale of the slaughter was unprecedented. But even kings were not safe. Edward was briefly deposed when a former ally, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, turned against him and restored Henry VI. Yet Edward returned, rallied forces, and reclaimed the crown, this time for good. Warwick was slain, and Henry VI, along with his son, was quietly eliminated. Edward's second reign brought peace, prosperity, and courtly elegance. But upon his sudden death in 1483, his young son, Edward V, was thrust into power. He never wore the crown. Instead, his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared the boy illegitimate and seized the throne as Richard III. Then came a whisper that would haunt the centuries. The princes in the Tower. Edward V and his brother were taken to the Tower of London and never seen again. Though evidence remains elusive, many believe Richard had them murdered to secure his rule. His reputation, immortalized by Shakespeare, became the embodiment of tyranny. Yet Richard's reign was short. A new challenger emerged, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant exiled in France. In 1485, he landed in Wales and marched inland. The final confrontation came at Bosworth Field. Richard, fighting bravely, was unhorsed and slain. His crown, found in the mud, was placed upon Henry's head on the battlefield. The Plantagenet era had ended. Henry became Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. To secure unity, he married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red rose and white into one, symbolically ending the Civil War. But peace was not easily won. Pretenders rose. Plots festered. Henry ruled with caution, surveillance, and financial cunning. He was not beloved, but he was effective. The legacy of the Wars of the Roses was profound. Entire noble houses were wiped out. Castles were abandoned. Children were orphaned and dynasties destroyed. Power had shifted irreversibly. Parliament, once summoned reluctantly, had now become essential for legitimacy and finance. England had learned to fear instability. The people craved order. Henry VII, sensing this, emphasized law, royal authority, and lineage. He streamlined government, broke the power of overmighty lords, and built alliances through marriage and diplomacy. The crown was no longer just a right, it was a structure. And yet, this period of pain produced more than bloodshed. It reshaped kingship into something more resilient. It moved England away from feudalism toward central governance. It forged a monarchy no longer protected solely by lineage or divine right, but also by law and perception. Out of the ruins of cousinly war emerged a more modern England, hardened, centralized, and poised for greatness. But as one age ended, another prepared to ignite. A dynasty would rise that would blend absolute authority with art, terror with splendor, and leave a legacy unmatched in English history. The Tudors were coming, and with them the Renaissance, the Reformation, and revolutions that would shake the world. The year was 1485, and England exhaled after decades of civil war. At Bosworth Field, a battered crown had been plucked from the mud and placed upon the brow of Henry Tudor, now Henry VII. The Tudors were not bred for greatness, but fate had opened a door. Through it they strode into legend. Henry VII was no warrior king. He was calculating, careful, and relentlessly pragmatic. His reign began with symbolism. He married Elizabeth of York, fusing red rose and white into the Tudor rose, a symbol of national unity. But beneath this floral harmony lay caution. Henry crushed pretenders, created a spy network, and taxed ruthlessly to stabilize the crown. He avoided foreign wars, built a robust treasury, and centralized power. Nobles were curbed. Royal courts, like the Star Chamber, ensured obedience. When he died in 1509, he left his son not only a throne, but a powerful state, ready to roar. Enter Henry VIII, larger than life in every sense. At 18, he dazzled the court. Handsome, athletic, musical, and deeply Catholic. But his reign would become one of obsession, wives, and religious revolution. His desire for a male heir would tear England away from Rome and send shockwaves across Christendom. Married to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's union brought him peace with Spain, but no son. When she aged and miscarried repeatedly, his eyes turned to her maid of honor, Anne Boleyn. Enamored, Henry sought a divorce. The Pope refused, so Henry broke with the Pope instead. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. Monasteries were dissolved, their treasures seized, their lands sold. England, once Rome's daughter, now stood defiantly alone. Gold flowed into the treasury. Power flowed to the throne, and gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. She was executed on charges of adultery and treason. Henry remarried 4 more times. His third wife, Jane Seymour, bore him a son, Edward VI, but died soon after. Henry's marriages were both personal tragedies and national spectacles, each with political consequences. Yet Henry was more than a lover and executioner. He modernized the navy, fortified the coasts, and founded institutions. His portraits, broad, commanding, legs planted like tree trunks, became propaganda. He was England personified, defiant, majestic, untamed. When Henry died in 1547, the crown passed to 9-year-old Edward VI, a sickly but precocious boy. Under Protestant advisors, England veered further from Catholicism. Latin Mass was replaced. Priests could marry. But Edward's reign was brief. He died at 15. Desperate to preserve Protestant reform, his advisors placed Lady Jane Grey on the throne. She ruled for 9 days before Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, seized power with popular support. Mary was Catholic, and she came to restore what had been broken. Her reign burned with zeal. Protestants were executed. Bishops were purged. Heresy trials filled courtrooms. The fires of Smithfield devoured the reformers. She became known as Bloody Mary, though her intentions were to purify, not destroy. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was wildly unpopular, and when she died childless, the nation once again stood at a crossroads. Onto this fragile stage stepped Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the Protestant princess born of scandal. Her reign, beginning in 1558, would become a golden legend. Under her, England flourished culturally, economically, and spiritually. Elizabeth was cunning. She used marriage proposals as diplomacy, never committing, always teasing. She kept enemies close, ministers closer, and the people entranced. Her court sparkled with poetry and drama. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser. Their words fed a national soul. Religion remained tense. Catholics plotted. Foreign powers threatened. But Elizabeth walked a middle path. Her religious settlement created a Church of England that retained some Catholic ritual but accepted Protestant doctrine. It wasn't peace, but it was stability. The greatest test came in 1588, when the Spanish Armada, a mighty fleet, sailed to crush England's heretic queen. Storms scattered them. English fireships wreaked havoc. The invincible Armada was humbled, and England emerged a naval power, an island nation reborn with purpose. Elizabeth remained unmarried, the Virgin Queen, a figure of independence, sacrifice, and divine favor. She ruled alone but was never alone in the hearts of her people. Her image was everywhere. Coins, paintings, plays. She became mythic. But beneath the pageantry, dangers loomed. No clear heir, a fragile succession. At her death in 1603, a nation wept, but it also held its breath. With no child of her own, the Tudor line ended. Yet her cousin James VI of Scotland stood ready to unite crowns that had long been divided. The Tudor era had remade England. It had broken the Pope's chains, raised a navy, and birthed a cultural renaissance. It had enthroned female monarchs, embraced spectacle, and turned the personal into the political. Most of all, it had taught England that power could wear many faces. The cautious financier, the towering tyrant, the burning zealot, the brilliant virgin. The Tudors were flawed, fierce, and unforgettable. And as the crown passed north, their legacy glowed still, bright, brutal, and immortal. When Elizabeth I exhaled her final breath in 1603, she left behind more than an empty throne. She left a kingdom poised between glory and uncertainty. The Tudor flame had burned brilliantly, but now it passed to unfamiliar hands, the Stuarts of Scotland, and with them came unity, ambition, and disaster. Her cousin James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns under a single monarch. Though England and Scotland remained legally distinct, they now shared a sovereign. James styled himself King of Great Britain, and while the idea was bold, it sparked resistance. He found himself a foreigner in his new realm, awkward, intellectual, and deeply convinced of his divine right to rule. James believed kings were God's lieutenants on earth, above Parliament, beyond question. This doctrine of divine right clashed with a growing English Parliament that had tasted power under the Tudors. The result was tension. Not yet open conflict, but a simmering unease that would define the century. Despite his absolutist views, James presided over a cultural golden age. The King James Bible, published in 1611, became one of the most influential texts in the English language. Theaters flourished. Shakespeare penned his final plays under James's rule. London teemed with merchants, poets, conspirators, and visionaries. But not all was well. In 1605, the Gunpowder Plot shook the nation. A group of Catholic extremists, including Guy Fawkes, attempted to blow up Parliament and assassinate the king. The plot failed, but it reignited anti-Catholic paranoia. Bonfires lit the sky. Fawkes was executed, and Protestant England tightened its grip. When James died in 1625, his son Charles I inherited the throne, and his father's belief in divine rule. But Charles lacked his father's political agility. Where James had compromised, Charles confronted. Where James spoke in riddles, Charles cloaked his intentions in silence. He married a Catholic French princess, deeply unpopular in a staunchly Protestant nation. He levied taxes without consent. He dissolved Parliament repeatedly. Eventually, he ruled without one for 11 years, a period remembered as the personal rule, or by his critics, the 11 years' tyranny. But even kings cannot govern alone forever. Needing funds to suppress a rebellion in Scotland, Charles recalled Parliament in 1640. What returned was no obedient body, but a radical and energized assembly bent on curbing royal power. The long-brewing tensions exploded. In 1642, after failed arrests, accusations of tyranny, and years of grievance, civil war erupted. Royalists or Cavaliers rallied around Charles and tradition. Parliamentarians or Roundheads rallied around Parliament and reform. The fields of England became battlegrounds. Families were torn. Churches were ransacked. Brothers fought brothers. The war was not only military, it was ideological. Could a king rule by God alone? Or must he answer to the people? The answer would be written in blood. After years of conflict, in 1649, Charles I was captured, tried for treason, and shockingly executed. For the first time in its history, England had killed its king. The axe fell in silence. Charles wore 2 shirts that day to prevent shivering in the cold, fearing people would mistake it for fear. His final words, "I am the King of England, the king of a people. I am the people's sacrifice." What followed was a republic, the Commonwealth, led by Oliver Cromwell, a military genius and devout Puritan. Parliament was purged. The monarchy was abolished. Bishops were dismissed. Theaters closed. Christmas banned. Cromwell ruled not as king, but as Lord Protector. But though England was now a republic in name, it was in truth a military dictatorship. Cromwell's campaigns in Ireland and Scotland were brutal. His moral rigor clashed with a people weary of control. Upon his death in 1658, chaos returned. The people had tried a world without kings and found it wanting. In 1660, with Cromwell gone and no heir strong enough to govern, England invited Charles II, son of the executed king, back to the throne. The restoration had begun. The monarchy returned, not as divine right, but by the will of Parliament. The crown now wore a shadow. The Stuarts had risen on the promise of unity and divine rule. Instead, they had fractured the kingdom, seen a king executed, and the very idea of monarchy questioned. Yet from this furnace of fire and fury, a new political reality was forged, one where the balance of power had shifted forever. England would never again be ruled the same way. The people had tasted agency. Parliament had flexed its muscle. The monarch, once sovereign and unquestionable, now ruled at the mercy of law and consent. As the Stuarts reclaimed their throne, they would find themselves navigating a kingdom not of subjects, but of citizens. The axe that fell on Charles I echoed across decades, but it did not sever England's longing for monarchy. In 1660, the wheel of fate turned once more. Amidst weary soldiers, broken churches, and a republic grown cold, the cry rose, "Bring back the king." And so Charles II returned, not just to the throne, but to a kingdom desperate for joy. The restoration was more than a political event, it was a cultural rebirth. London burst into life. Theaters reopened, music soared, and fashion dazzled. The merry monarch, as Charles was called, filled his court with wit, art, and scandal. His mistresses became legends, his parties the envy of Europe. After years of Puritan gloom, the nation rejoiced in laughter. Yet Charles was no fool. He remembered his father's fate. Though outwardly carefree, he ruled carefully. He avoided direct confrontation with Parliament, played factions against each other, and balanced his Catholic sympathies with Protestant appearances. He was king but not absolute. Still, storm clouds gathered. A devastating plague in 1665 killed tens of thousands in London. The next year, the Great Fire of London consumed much of the city. Out of the ashes, Christopher Wren would raise St. Paul's Cathedral, but for a moment, it felt as if judgment lingered. Suspicion returned. Charles's flirtations with Catholicism alarmed a Protestant nation. Whispers of a popish plot and fear of a Catholic heir began to dominate public discourse. When Charles died in 1685, his brother, James II, took the throne, and the unease turned to crisis. James was openly Catholic, and unlike Charles, he lacked political subtlety. He promoted Catholics to high office, dissolved Parliament, and claimed divine authority. His queen, Mary of Modena, bore him a son, a Catholic heir. The nation trembled. Had they fought civil war only to fall back into tyranny? A group of nobles, desperate to preserve Protestant rule, secretly reached out to William of Orange, a Dutch prince married to James's Protestant daughter, Mary. William landed in England in 1688 with an army, but he was welcomed as a savior. James fled. No battles were fought. No blood was shed. It was the Glorious Revolution. In 1689, William and Mary were crowned joint monarchs, but on Parliament's terms. They signed the Bill of Rights, which limited royal power, cemented the rights of Parliament, and ensured no Catholic could ever sit on the throne again. The divine right of kings was dead. Constitutional monarchy was born. This revolution didn't merely change England, it reshaped the Western world. It enshrined the supremacy of law over kings, inspired Enlightenment thinkers, and laid philosophical groundwork for democratic revolutions centuries later. Under William, England entered a new age of international ambition. The Bank of England was established. The Act of Toleration granted freedom to Protestant dissenters. But war with France and tensions in Ireland cast shadows on progress. At the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, William defeated James, who had fled to Ireland, with Protestant victory etched into Irish memory and pain. After Mary's death, and later William's, the crown passed to Mary's sister Anne. Her reign saw the final union of England and Scotland in 1707, forming the Kingdom of Great Britain. Two ancient rivals now shared one parliament, one flag, and one crown. It was a union born of necessity, financial, political, and dynastic, but also deeply contested. Anne's rule was marked by military glory under the Duke of Marlborough in the War of the Spanish Succession, but also by personal tragedy. She bore 17 children. None survived to adulthood. When she died in 1714, the Stuart line ended, not with a bang, but with silence. To prevent a Catholic return, the crown passed to the distant House of Hanover. A German prince, George I, now ruled England, unable to speak fluent English, uninterested in ceremony, but deeply tied to Protestant Europe. The age of native kings gave way to foreign governance, brokered through ministers and parliament. With the Stuarts gone, their supporters, the Jacobites, rose in rebellion. In 1715 and again in 1745, they tried to restore the true king to the throne. The Second Rebellion, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, ended at Culloden, the last battle fought on British soil. The dream of a Stuart restoration died there, amid cannon fire and Highland tears. Yet the legacy of the Stuarts was indelible. They had presided over an age of religious conflict, civil war, revolution, and rebirth. Their downfall gave rise to principles of liberty, limited monarchy, and parliamentary rule that would echo far beyond Britain's shores. No dynasty in British history swung so wildly between adoration and execution, splendor and collapse. From the poetry of the King James Bible to the firelit gallows of Charles I, from Restoration masquerades to glorious revolutions, they shaped the modern monarchy not by stability, but by resistance to tyranny. As the 18th century dawned, Britain stood transformed. No longer a realm of feuding roses or divine kings, it was becoming something else entirely. A constitutional empire with ambitions stretching across oceans, and a people whose power now pulsed through Parliament. As the 18th century dawned, the crown rested on unfamiliar heads. The Hanoverian dynasty, foreign by blood but English by necessity, ushered in a new kind of monarchy, one shaped not by divine right, but by political pragmatism. With George I in 1714, Britain's sovereign spoke more German than English, relied heavily on ministers, and rarely engaged in ceremony. The age of royal absolutism had faded. Power now flowed elsewhere, into Parliament, into finance, and across the seas. George I's disinterest in governance opened the door for Britain's first Prime Minister in all but name, Sir Robert Walpole. For over 2 decades, Walpole balanced power, avoided war, and steered Britain into an era of relative stability. The monarchy became a symbol. The machinery of rule turned behind parliamentary doors. This was the foundation of modern constitutional monarchy. As politics simmered at home, the embers of empire began to blaze abroad. British merchants, backed by naval might, expanded their reach from the West Indies to India, from Africa to the American colonies. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, and tea filled British coffers, while the dark stain of the transatlantic slave trade enriched the few and enslaved the many. In Scotland, the defeat of the Jacobite rebellion at Culloden in 1746 ended Highland dreams of a Stuart revival. It was not just a military loss, it marked the cultural suppression of an entire people. Kilts, bagpipes, and the Gaelic tongue were outlawed. Yet, over time, Highland identity would be romanticized and co-opted into the very Britishness it once resisted. Under George II, Britain became a key player in global wars. In the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, often called the First World War, Britain fought France across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. The result was a stunning victory. Canada, Florida, and large parts of India came under British influence. The British Empire now stretched like never before. But empire came at a price. In the American colonies, taxes and control imposed from London sparked fury. Cries of no taxation without representation thundered across the Atlantic. In 1776, 13 colonies declared independence. Britain, led by George III, fought to preserve its grasp but failed. The American Revolution shocked the nation. It was not just a political loss. It was an identity crisis. Could Britain still be an empire without America? Could the monarchy survive such humiliation? George III, often mocked and later plagued by mental illness, became the face of this imperial decline, though in truth the empire had only just begun its pivot. The loss of America forced Britain to look east. India, long the jewel of trade, became the new cornerstone of expansion. The East India Company, a corporate giant with private armies, gradually took control. Following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, British influence deepened. By the turn of the century, Britain ruled millions of Indians, not through kingship but commerce and conquest. Domestically, the Industrial Revolution ignited. Coal-powered machines, textile mills, and steam engines transformed the nation. Cities swelled. Smoke choked the skies. A new class emerged, the industrial bourgeoisie. Britain no longer just ruled land, it ruled production, time, and labor. But not all prospered. While factory owners grew rich, child labor, slums, and disease plagued the poor. Yet even as suffering mounted, so did innovation. Canals, railways, iron ships, Britain was no longer just an island. It was becoming the workshop of the world. The monarchy under George III endured despite scandal. In 1801, with Ireland brought into union through political maneuvering and suppression of Catholic emancipation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was born. The Union Jack now fluttered over an empire both majestic and merciless. After George III's decline into madness, his son ruled as Prince Regent, later crowned George IV. He was flamboyant, indulgent, and disconnected from the hardships of industrial Britain. But he also oversaw a cultural flowering, Regency architecture, the novels of Jane Austen, and the continued expansion of London as an imperial capital. By the time George IV died, the Hanoverians had become thoroughly British. They no longer seemed foreign, though they still ruled from gilded palaces above the smog. With the coming of Queen Victoria, they would preside over the empire's zenith, but their roots were here, in the Georgian age of trade, war, and transformation. The 18th century had witnessed Britain's most dramatic evolution yet. From the loss of America to the rise of India, from feudal pastures to smoking factories, it emerged not just as a kingdom, but as a global force. Its monarchs were no longer divine. They were constitutional. Its wars were no longer local. They were planetary. And behind it all was a rising tension between the wealth of empire and the cost of conscience, between innovation and exploitation, between crown and commoner. The stage was now set for a new queen and a new kind of empire. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, she was only 18, shy, sheltered, and unsure. But the girl who once signed her name with a trembling hand would become an empress, a symbol of morality, power, and paradox. Her reign would define an age, an empire, an identity. This was the Victorian era, and it changed everything. Victoria inherited a Britain on the move. The Industrial Revolution was in full throttle. Railways stitched the land. Telegraph wires spanned cities. Factories roared with life. Coal fed furnaces and dreams. The world was speeding up, and Britain was in the driver's seat. She married her cousin, Prince Albert, a man of intellect and discipline. Together, they forged a domestic monarchy, one rooted in virtue and duty. The royal family became the nation's moral compass, presenting themselves not as aloof sovereigns, but as paragons of family life. Albert was no idle consort. He championed education, technology, and the arts. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the glittering Crystal Palace, showcased Britain's dominance in industry, science, and design. It was the empire under glass, gleaming, modern, and unstoppable. But beneath the grandeur was complexity. The empire sprawled across continents. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia, Britain ruled hundreds of millions. This was not merely a trading network, it was global dominion, built on military strength, naval power, and economic coercion. In India, the jewel of the crown, British control tightened after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Sparked by cultural insensitivity and deep resentment, the uprising shook the empire. The East India Company was abolished, and India was brought directly under the crown. In 1876, Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, an empress over a land she never saw, yet one she romanticized in letters and portraits. Britain's imperial mission was cloaked in a language of civilization. Schools, railways, and governance were touted as gifts. But exploitation ran deep. Resources were extracted, local industries suppressed, and cultures reshaped under a British mold. Colonialism, though wrapped in elegance, was rooted in dominance. At home, the industrial boom bred extremes. London's palaces glittered, while slums festered. Child labor persisted. Chimneys choked the skies. Reformers like Charles Dickens, Florence Nightingale, and Charles Booth exposed the nation's contradictions. The Poor Law, Public Health Acts, and workers' movements emerged from this age of inequality. And yet, this was also an age of belief in progress, empire, and moral duty. The Victorians saw history as ascending toward perfection. Missions were sent to Africa and Asia, not only for commerce but for souls. Christianity, science, and industry marched hand in hand, sometimes enlightening, sometimes erasing. The British Navy controlled the seas. The red ensign fluttered in every ocean. Steamships replaced sail. The Suez Canal opened new imperial arteries. A small island had become the world's heartbeat. The sun never sets on the British Empire, they proudly said. And they were right. Yet not all subjects bowed quietly. Irish nationalism surged. The Fenians agitated for freedom. Famines and evictions fueled rebellion and diaspora. In Africa and Asia, resistances brewed quietly, even as Queen Victoria's portrait hung in classrooms and courtrooms. Victoria, in mourning after Albert's death in 1861, wore black for the rest of her life. Her withdrawal from public life stirred Republican murmurs. But she gradually returned. Her Jubilee in 1887 and Diamond Jubilee in 1897 turned her into a living symbol. Mother of Empire, Queen of half the world. Science raced ahead. Darwin's theories challenged traditional faith. Railways and medicine changed lives. Education expanded. The Victorian mindset, a strange mix of certainty and fear, grappled with rapid change. Toward the end of her reign, cracks began to show. In South Africa, the Boer Wars revealed the limits of British military power. In India and Egypt, dissent grew more organized. Britain remained mighty but no longer unchallenged. In 1901, Queen Victoria died after 63 years on the throne. She had witnessed more change than any monarch before her. From the age of candlelight to electric bulbs, from sail to steam, from monarchy to modernity, she had reigned over transformation. Her death marked the end of an age. The Victorian era, so proud and powerful, so moral and hypocritical, faded into twilight. Britain stood atop the world, but shadows were lengthening. Behind the triumphs of empire, the costs had grown heavy. And in the new century, rising nationalism, bitter rivalries, and industrialized warfare would threaten everything the Victorians had built. The dawn of the 20th century found Britain at its imperial height. Queen Victoria was dead, but her empire, the largest in human history, remained. The Union Jack flew over a quarter of the globe. Trade flowed, power thrummed. But beneath the imperial grandeur, pressure built, social, political, and geopolitical. The old world was beginning to fracture. Edward VII, Victoria's son, took the throne in 1901. Affable, cosmopolitan, and deeply involved in diplomacy, he ushered in the Edwardian era, a brief, gilded interlude. It was a time of opulence and elegance, of tea gardens and ocean liners, of technological marvels and quiet decadence. But it was also an age of anxiety. Beneath the lace and civility, something stirred. Social divisions widened. The labor movement gained momentum. Women, denied the vote and confined to the domestic sphere, began to rise in protest. The suffragettes, led by fiery voices like Emmeline Pankhurst, marched, chained themselves to railings, endured prison and hunger strikes. The old order could no longer silence the new. Meanwhile, Europe stood on a razor's edge. Empires jostled. Alliances hardened. Nationalism flared. And in 1914, a single bullet in Sarajevo ignited World War I. Britain, bound by treaty and pride, joined the conflict. The empire was mobilized. Canada, India, Australia, and Africa sent men, supplies, and loyalty. It was the first truly global war. The war was unlike anything the world had known. Machine guns, trenches, gas, tanks, technologies of death. Young men were mowed down by the thousands in the mud of the Somme, Passchendaele, and Ypres. A generation vanished into the mire. At home, the war changed everything. Women entered factories, drove ambulances, ran farms. Rationing became normal. Class boundaries blurred. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world was older, wearier, and less certain of its gods. The empire had endured, but not unscathed. George V, now king, faced a transformed Britain. The Representation of the People Act in 1918 gave the vote to women over 30. By 1928, they had full suffrage. The Labour Party, once a fringe force, became a major political power. The aristocracy's grip weakened. But if the First World War was a fracture, the years that followed threatened collapse. In Ireland, rebellion had been simmering for decades. The Easter Rising of 1916, crushed with brutality, only hardened Irish resolve. By 1921, after bloody struggle, Ireland was partitioned. The South became the Irish Free State, a blow to imperial unity and a wound still felt. The 1930s brought global depression. British industry faltered. The empire remained, but its people suffered. Appeasement governed foreign policy as the storm of fascism gathered in Europe. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and Britain once again found itself at war. World War II was total. The Blitz rained fire on London. Churchill's voice, iron, poetic, defiant, carried the nation through its darkest hours. "We shall never surrender," he declared, and Britain stood alone against tyranny until the tides turned. Colonial troops fought bravely once more. From India to Africa to the Caribbean, the empire bled for a nation that still denied many of them equal rights. Yet victory came in 1945, first in Europe, then in the Pacific. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The war had been won, but the empire would never recover. Post-war Britain was exhausted, economically battered, morally humbled, and politically changed. A landslide victory in 1945 brought in Clement Attlee's Labour government, which birthed the National Health Service, nationalized key industries, and ushered in the welfare state. It was a quiet revolution of fairness, equality, and rebirth. But the empire was dying. India, the crown jewel, won independence in 1947, amid partition and horror. Pakistan was born. Soon Ghana, Kenya, Malaya, and others followed. By the 1960s, decolonization was in full swing. The empire, once the engine of Britain's pride, dissolved into a commonwealth of former colonies, an echo of past grandeur. The monarchy itself shifted. Elizabeth II, crowned in 1953, reigned over a world utterly changed. Television, civil rights, youth rebellion, and globalization reshaped British identity. From Suez humiliation to punk anarchy, from the Beatles to Brexit, her reign would span 7 decades of seismic change. World wars had redefined Britain's place in the world. No longer the imperial titan, it became a middle power, respected, resilient, and reflective. The monarchy adapted, the people endured, and democracy deepened. Yet the shadow of lost empire lingered, in politics, in memory, in migration, and in myth. The 20th century left scars, but also wisdom. A nation that had once ruled waves now stood at peace with the tide. Its crown lighter, but still gleaming. In the smoking aftermath of World War II, Britain stood bruised but unbroken. The empire was fading, the economy faltering, but the spirit of reinvention stirred in the air. The bombed-out streets of London, the coal-dusted towns of the north, the returning soldiers, all carried the same question. What now? The answer at first was vision. In 1945, a landslide victory swept Clement Attlee and the Labour Party into power. What followed was a quiet revolution. Out of war's ashes, a new Britain was born, one of social justice, collective responsibility, and state welfare. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, became the heart of this vision. Free healthcare for all, regardless of wealth. Council housing replaced bombed ruins. Education expanded. Industries were nationalized. The idea of cradle-to-grave care was no longer just a dream. Britain, though poor in coin, was rich in hope. At the same time, the empire unraveled. In India, Pakistan, and later Sri Lanka, independence surged forth. Across Africa and the Caribbean, flags were lowered, and new nations rose. For some Britons, this was loss. For others, justice. Either way, the world Britain once ruled was slipping away. Yet something remarkable happened. As former colonies gained independence, their people began to migrate to Britain, answering labor shortages and seeking opportunity. Ships like the HMT Empire Windrush, arriving in 1948, brought waves of Caribbean migrants to British shores. From India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Ghana came thousands more. These new Britons faced hardship, racism, and exclusion, yet they built lives, communities, and legacies, transforming Britain into a multicultural nation. Cities changed, accents blended, food, music, fashion all evolved. Britain was no longer just Anglo-Saxon, it was global in its own skin. In 1952, Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne. Young, composed, and deeply dutiful, she became a beacon of continuity. Her coronation was televised, the first for many Britons to witness history unfold in real time. The monarchy, once distant, now entered their living rooms. The 1950s and 60s brought tension and optimism. The Suez Crisis of 1956 revealed Britain's reduced power on the world stage. Humiliated by America, it became clear that Britain was no longer an imperial lion, but a European middleweight. Yet at home, prosperity bloomed. Washing machines, cars, televisions, these became common. And then came rebellion. The swinging 60s erupted in London streets and clubs. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and David Bowie redefined global culture. Mini-skirts, psychedelia, and punk anarchy shredded tradition. The youth weren't looking back, they were dancing forward. Meanwhile, social upheaval simmered. Race riots in Notting Hill and Bristol, strikes and coal disputes, feminism, gay rights. Britain was shedding its skin. The old hierarchies were challenged at every level. The monarchy, though still admired, became a lightning rod for debate. The 1970s brought turbulence. Economic stagnation, oil crises, and industrial unrest created a bleak portrait. The winter of discontent gripped the nation. Then came a political earthquake. The election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Britain's first female prime minister governed with iron will. Thatcher broke unions, privatized industries, and championed individualism over collective welfare. Her policies reshaped the economy, praising wealth, punishing idleness, but also deepened divides. To some, she saved Britain. To others, she shattered it. Under Thatcher, the Falklands War in 1982 rekindled a flicker of imperial pride. British troops defended distant islands against Argentina, and won. Her unyielding stance made her a global figure, but also alienated many at home. Meanwhile, Princess Diana, the people's princess, reignited public passion for the monarchy. Her grace, vulnerability, and charity work made her beloved worldwide. Yet her marriage to Prince Charles unraveled in full public view, exposing cracks behind palace walls. Diana's tragic death in 1997 stunned the nation. Grief flooded the streets. The monarchy, seen as distant and unfeeling, was forced to adapt. Queen Elizabeth II, always composed, made an unprecedented live broadcast. It was a moment of reckoning and evolution. As the millennium turned, Tony Blair's government brought a new wave of optimism. Devolution gave Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland their own assemblies. Peace in Northern Ireland, brokered through the Good Friday Agreement, ended decades of bloody sectarian conflict. Britain entered the 21st century as a different nation. Less industrial, more service-driven. Less imperial, more introspective. Waves of immigration from Eastern Europe and beyond reshaped cities. Multiculturalism wasn't an idea, it was a reality. Terrorism struck, most horrifically in the 7/7 bombings of 2005. Brexit debates stirred old nationalist ghosts. The London Olympics of 2012 reminded the world of Britain's ability to inspire. In every triumph and trauma, the nation was learning to define itself not by what it ruled, but by what it stood for. Through it all, the monarchy endured. Queen Elizabeth II remained a constant presence, unchanging in a sea of change. Her quiet strength, sense of duty, and longevity became threads woven into the modern British fabric. The 21st century dawned with fireworks, hope, and the quiet hum of uncertainty. Britain entered the new millennium with global respect, multicultural vibrance, and political stability. But underneath this modern image lay unresolved tensions about identity, sovereignty, and unity. The next decades would test the very fabric of the kingdom. After the Iraq War in 2003, a shadow fell over Tony Blair's premiership. While he had promised modernization and reform, his alignment with the United States in a controversial war fractured public trust. The decision sparked massive protests and reawakened skepticism toward Britain's global role in the post-imperial era. Domestically, the nation wrestled with balancing tradition and diversity. Immigration, especially after the EU expansion in 2004, brought workers from Eastern Europe. While many embraced this new multiculturalism, others felt left behind, economically strained and culturally adrift. The gap between cosmopolitan cities and rural towns widened. In 2008, the global financial crisis rocked the world, and Britain was not spared. Banks collapsed, austerity deepened, and the welfare state began to contract. A generation found itself burdened by debt and disillusionment. The dream of endless progress began to unravel. Meanwhile, the monarchy maintained its symbolic hold. Queen Elizabeth II, now in her 80s, remained a pillar of continuity. Her Diamond Jubilee in 2012 drew millions to the streets. Yet a younger generation looked not just at her stoicism, but also at her grandchildren William, Harry, and Kate as the future faces of the institution. In 2016, Britain stood at a crossroads. A national referendum asked a deceptively simple question: Should the United Kingdom remain in the European Union? The result: leave, 52%, remain, 48%, shook the nation. The decision to leave the EU, known as Brexit, exposed deep societal rifts. London, Scotland, and Northern Ireland voted to remain. England's heartlands and much of Wales voted to leave. The result was not just a policy shift, it was an identity crisis. What did it mean to be British in a post-European era? Sovereignty had been reclaimed, but unity frayed. Political chaos followed. Prime ministers came and went. David Cameron, who called the referendum, resigned. Theresa May struggled to negotiate a deal. Boris Johnson eventually led Britain out of the EU in 2020, but at great political and cultural cost. The pandemic of COVID-19 further strained the country. Lockdowns, economic shocks, and over 200,000 deaths left deep scars. The NHS, long a symbol of national pride, was stretched to its limits. Heroes wore scrubs, not armor, and the nation clapped each week in quiet gratitude. In the midst of these upheavals, the monarchy faced its own storm. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, once celebrated as symbols of modern inclusion, stepped back from royal duties. Their interview with Oprah revealed emotional trauma, racism, and internal strife. The monarchy was forced to confront the demands of transparency in a digital, diverse world. And then, in 2022, the unthinkable, Queen Elizabeth II died at the age of 96. The woman who had been queen since 1952, through war, revolution, and rebirth, was gone. The nation mourned. Crowds gathered silently. Her funeral was watched by billions. A chapter in British life had closed. King Charles III ascended the throne, not a young reformer, but a monarch decades in waiting. His reign began not with youthful vision but with the heavy burden of transition. He inherited a nation fragmented, politically, culturally, economically. His task was not to dazzle but to steady. Brexit's aftermath lingered. Scotland once again revived talk of independence. Northern Ireland grappled with its place in the UK and the EU. Britain's global role shifted from leader to question mark. Still powerful, still admired, but no longer central. Culturally, Britain remained a paradox. It was a hub of innovation, music, and thought, yet haunted by its colonial past. Statues fell. Debates raged about history, identity, and the future. What did it mean to be British in a post-imperial, post-European, post-Elizabethan age? Technology reshaped life. Social media amplified every voice and every division. Politics became more polarized. But amid all this noise, Britain also showed resilience. In its art, in its humor, in its quiet compassion during crisis. The monarchy adapted slowly. New generations sought relevance in climate change, mental health, and inclusivity. Prince William emerged as a future king rooted in service, more approachable, more attuned. Yet the road ahead was uncertain. As the 2020s unfold, Britain remains a kingdom in flux, torn between past and future, between nostalgia and reinvention. But the story is far from over. This history is not a line, but a circle, a dialogue between what was and what could be. The story of Britain is not merely a chronicle of kings, wars, and empires. It is a living epic, a testament to resilience, reinvention, and the enduring power of ideas. From misty prehistory to digital modernity, the British Isles have shaped and been shaped by the world around them. And yet, the tale is far from finished. Across its long arc, Britain has worn many faces. A land of druids and stone circles, a Roman province, a Viking frontier, a Norman conquest. It became a kingdom of warring houses, a crucible of religion, and eventually an empire where the sun never set. With each metamorphosis came upheaval but also rebirth. Its monarchy, once divine and absolute, now stands as symbolic and ceremonial. And yet, within that symbolism lies strength. The crown today is not an emblem of conquest but continuity. It survives because it evolves. Because, like Britain itself, it listens to the drumbeat of time. The British people, once defined by class and tradition, have become a tapestry woven from every corner of the globe. Windrush, South Asian migration, European expansion, all have brought voices that now sing in a distinctly British chorus. In curry shops, corner pubs, cricket fields, and street carnivals, the empire has come home and made peace with itself. But peace, like history, is never static. Britain remains a nation of debate. The struggle over its soul continues. Is it a European nation? An Atlantic one? A global leader or a reflective elder? The Brexit vote proved that identity here is no simple matter. Britishness is not a single mold, but a negotiation of many legacies. The old narratives of empire and supremacy have faded, but in their place rises something more human. A nation that can reckon with its past, learn from its failures, and still hold pride in its contributions. Parliamentary democracy, the English language, Shakespeare, Newton, Darwin, the Beatles, the NHS, and more. The scars of history remain, etched in statues, in scars of industrial decline, in lingering inequalities. But so too do the triumphs. The Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, the victory over fascism, the decolonization of half the world, and the peaceful transitions of royal power. In the 21st century, Britain faces new battles against climate change, misinformation, inequality, and division. But it also holds tools forged over centuries. Rule of law, free speech, satire, literature, tolerance, and above all, a belief that change, no matter how slow, is possible. Its institutions endure: Parliament, the monarchy, the BBC, the courts, the universities. They are not perfect, but they are resilient, and they are watched, questioned, challenged by citizens who once had no voice, but now shape the future. The death of Queen Elizabeth II marked the end of an epoch, the last link to Churchill, empire, and a century of global realignment. Her reign, marked by stoicism and stability, closed a book. Her son, King Charles III, begins a new one, not of domination, but of relevance, of symbolism earned, not assumed. And beyond the monarchy, the people continue to lead the real transformation. Artists, scientists, nurses, comedians, coders, teachers, and thinkers, all quietly building the Britain of tomorrow. For in the end, Britain's greatest legacy is not its royalty or conquests. It is the simple, enduring truth that a small island, often divided, often wounded, has again and again chosen adaptation over collapse, dialogue over silence, dignity over defeat. Its story, once carved in stone, then printed in parchment, now streamed across screens, is not done. Each generation writes its verse. Each crisis opens a new chapter, and each quiet citizen, as much as any king, carries the pen. The crown may glitter atop a royal head, but the soul of Britain, restless, curious, contradictory, rests in the hearts of its people. Their journey, like the nation's, is unfinished. The isles that once had no name have now left one etched upon history, united yet ever becoming.